How would former presidents approach today's fiscal debt crisis? Good evening, everyone. I'm Linda Laurel. Welcome to Red, White, and Blue. In his book, America's Fiscal Constitution, Its Triumph and Collapse, former Houston Mayor Bill White explores America's fiscal policy and how our forefathers imposed limits on the use of debt. In his book, White describes how our leaders borrowed only for extraordinary purposes and relied on well-defined budget practices to aid in balancing federal spending. So in a time when spending seems out of control and our nation's debt keeps rising, what lessons can be learned from our forefathers? What budget myths can be dispelled? And can our nation ever become financially independent? Tonight, to help us explore budgetary policy, we are very pleased to welcome the author himself, Bill White. As always, leading our discussion, our hosts, David Jones and Gary Polland.
Well, Gary, as you know, that this is the opening round in the campaign for Treasury Secretary under Hillary Clinton, right here. Listen to this. He writes a 400-page book, a history of about debt in the United States, and he wants us to believe he's a historian. I'm telling you, the guy is about to get into higher office.
Well, I actually think that Bill White would do a terrific job as Secretary of the Treasury, though I'd prefer to him to be the Democratic appointment in the next Republican administration.
Well, that's right.
So now that we have that out of the way, I want you to talk the book. Why did you decide to write the book?
You know, I was worried about the rising federal debt, and I wanted to have a blueprint about what we could do about it. And I didn't think that, too many people were resigned that we couldn't do anything about it. But the fact is that for most of American history, we managed to balance the budget. Conservatives to progressives believe that we shouldn't mortgage our future, and we only borrowed for extraordinary emergencies. So I thought I'd tell the story of how we balanced the budget in the past.
Well, here's what I got from the book.
Yep.
First, I liked the early, historical stuff, and I love the Civil War era parts of the book. But I really focused on the last 30 years.
Yeah.
And what I got from the book was that Jimmy Carter's 1980 really broke, finally, the New Deal, Great Society consensus in the Democratic Party, which of course brought us 8 years of Reaganomics, finally interrupted with George Bush acting like a real statesman in his tax increase and budget deal in 1990. Of course, he was punished for that, and we have been now occupied by a Republican Party protecting plutocrats, millionaires, theocrats, and we're in big trouble.
Okay, well, that was just a polemic, is what that was.
That's what I got.
In case you were wondering.
Is that not what you said?
Well, not exactly, but I would say you're right that 1980 was a turning point. This was the year before Reagan became president, because you had a group led by Ted Kennedy who wanted to expand medical coverage. You had another group, bipartisan, led by Scoop Jackson, who wanted to rev up spending on the Cold War. You had interest rates which were rising, that caused rising federal interest expense, which you have to pay. And finally, Americans had about reached their limit on the Cold War tax system. So you had pressures to both reduce taxes and to raise spending. Now, in the past, what we had done as a nation is we had had an open and honest debate about this, and people had decided what the trade-off was. But the dam began breaking, where it was tempting for politicians to disguise the cost of government with debt and claim that they were limiting the size of government by limiting taxes.
So is the problem today that we are electing to office, for the most part, politicians that are more interested in spending other people's money than actually managing the government in an appropriate way?
Well, I mean, certainly I'd say probably there's a few more who are interested in the short run than the long run. And that's occurring in both political parties. I mean, the fact of the matter is, I don't think today's in private Republican or Democratic leadership on Capitol Hill is satisfied with where we are. The amount of interest we're going to pay on debts from Iraq, Afghanistan, the prescription drug benefit and tax cuts and all that stuff, plus rising cost of Medicare, is forcing the interest expense up. It's going to double in the next 6 years. the baby boom generation is retiring, and no matter what you do on the cost per beneficiary, that's going to go up. And as a result, there's not going to be room for other domestic programs or for any tax relief. Now, how can that be a desirable outcome?
Well, how about this as some rebuttal to your, especially to the title?
Yeah.
You know, I would say, in looking at some numbers today, what collapse? We have after-tax profits, or the corporate profits, highest in 70 years. Effective corporate tax rate, lowest in 70 years. Annualized increase in in the Dow, highest in 70 years. We've got 11 million new people with health care. We've got a deficit rate that is being reduced as a percentage of GDP every year. So what really is collapsing?
Well, you know, certainly the country isn't collapsing, period, end of story. And we can still sell debt because everybody in the world likes the dollar, and our country has a better legal and monetary system than other countries in the world, granted. But what I talk about collapsing is the Fiscal Constitution, is the fact that you know, you ought to pay as you go in ordinary time. And here's the problem with debt. The problem with debt is that the more you use in debt, you have to pay back debt with interest later on. And so that as the years go by, more and more of each tax dollar gets absorbed by interest and debt service, and less is available to pay for everything else. So you get less value out of each tax dollar. That's never been either a conservative or progressive ideal. It's more like a math principle.
But do you agree that this president is doing the best he can and has actually caused the economy to improve?
Yeah, I would say that there is a traditional use of debt, which is to plug budget holes during downturns when you have drop in revenues and provide some relief. And when both President George W. Bush did that in 2008 and Barack Obama did that after the election, that was a traditional use of debt. Now, we can argue about whether people supported it or opposed it, but it was a traditional use of debt. Today, national income is at an all-time high. It's not a family income for every family is not at an all-time high, but national income is at an all-time high. So if we can't, you know, balance a budget when national income is at an all-time high, then then we won't. And to highlight your issue, David, I think it's perfectly understandable that people were frustrated that a person who, you know, is over 65 can get Medicare and some of the finest medical treatment in the world, but somebody who may be a few months younger who has the same condition could be bankrupt or faced with the loss of their life. There's only one good explanation for why that persisted for so long. We couldn't even afford the Medicare that we were providing.
And we still can't. I mean,
not afford it. Let me say we couldn't pay for it. We were borrowing to pay for Medicare. I have no problem with somebody saying, okay, we want to do this, let's tax people and pay for it. But when you say, let's pay rising medical bills with debt, which is coming due when the population is going to be older, I just don't buy that.
Doesn't make any sense. And in fact, Obama's plan is taking money from Medicare, and the reimbursement rates are down for doctors. It's a colossal mess, but that's not what we're here to deal with. What I'm interested in is the mentality, well, actually the mentality that you operated in as mayor and the constraints you had. Do you think there are any lessons for the rules and regulations you had to deal with as a mayor of a major city, and the rules and regulations regarding what you could incur debt for that we could apply for the federal government?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, you know, every city, county, and state in the country cannot borrow to pay operating expenses. And then for almost all of these jurisdictions, city, county, and state governments, you have to have bond issues approved by voters in order to incur debt. And that forces hard choices, like as you describe in the book, when Governor Reagan came in, he had to dramatically increase taxes in California and do some cuts in services, but most of it was increase in taxes because he was compelled to balance a budget, and that was a fiscally responsible thing to do. And so, you know, I don't buy the idea that you can't do this. And when I was mayor, I'd go to Civic Club meetings all the time, and people would say, okay, well, why don't I see more police on patrol and 2 policemen in a vehicle? And I would, you know, say, well, if you did that, you're going to have to either cut your EMS service or cut the substantial amount of money we invested to keep our roads free of potholes, or I'm going to have to raise property taxes. So these are the trade-offs. And then we would have a discussion back and forth. And I think, and people may not agree with how we resolve those issues, but at least in meeting after meeting, I thought that people were able to deal with those questions as adults.
Oh, you've mentioned potholes, and
Yeah.
that scares me because Gary has pictures that he'll show you, but I hope that he left his phone somewhere. The other thing about your book, especially beginning in the last term of, the only term of Jimmy Carter, something happened in 1979 that has been on the chart and now off the chart, which is the percentage of national income going to the top 1%. It started in 1979 and it has not stopped.
Right.
So I wonder if you agree with the IMF economists who say that income inequality is a serious drag on growth and must be addressed if we are going to save economies and keep democracies stable.
Well, I think there's most people in the United States, for a variety of reasons, of which that may be one, believe that income inequality and growing income inequality is not a good thing. On this particular topic, borrowing money doesn't help income it doesn't solve that problem. Income inequality, my personal view, and looking at a lot of literature, is caused by the forces of globalization and technological change, which have resulted in a tremendous difference in the value that the market system accords to somebody who may be doing a job and working very hard, growing jute, or some have a small farm in South Asia, versus somebody who can write social media software that hundreds of millions of people use. There's a huge difference in the market's perception of that and the rewards for that. Now, the way to sort of cure that is through investment in education and skills and that sort of thing, but not borrowing money, because when you think about it, going into debt is sort of the opposite of investment, because you're really you're mortgaging future savings.
You talked about earlier in the conversation the road we are on now, and that you talked about traditional debt by the federal government when the economy slows down. But now that the economy is in recovery, you kind of wonder why there's been no real effort to reduce the debt, except that there's no will in Washington. You have to come to that conclusion. Some would argue that the divided government has caused that, but my argument would be the opposite, is that the problem is we don't have enough Republicans in Washington to work with a president who's willing to work with them, which I don't think Obama is.
Yeah, but I don't think that, I mean, there's one pretty simple thing that you could do to test that theory. The Republicans will vote on a budget within the next week or so in the House. And that budget will have spending. This is the Republican budget. It's not going to be enacted, but it's not going to be appropriated. It's going to be, and actually last year they passed one just like that had, last year they passed one with about $600 billion in spending greater than available revenues. This year, maybe $500 billion of spending greater than available revenues. So how does somebody who passes a budget, and why is that? I'll tell you why it is, because if you don't want to raise taxes,
right,
and you're only paying for 55% of Medicare with dedicated revenues, and you don't want to cut Medicare, then that's what you got. Then you got, if you want to increase defense spending, but you don't want to increase revenues, and you're in deficit already, then you're going to increase debt.
We have to talk about some solutions in a
do
minute.
have to talk about
I want
I'm
to.
sure David's first solution would be tax
I wanna
the
ask you
wealthy
this.
at 100%.
You know, you're going to have to hand deliver a book to all these people. You know, the Senate Finance Committee just recently reauthorized $85 billion in tax breaks, deductions, and subsidies, all for business, and it's not paid for. We had a farm bill that passed in February. $1 trillion over 10 years, 80% of it for non-farming enterprises.
Yeah, like food stamps.
Top
things
10%
like that.
of the farmers got 75% of the benefits. I mean, we still have tax write-offs for airplanes, yachts, beach houses, mortgage interest, carried interest tax loophole for hedge fund operators. I mean, majority of the members of Congress are millionaires. I mean, I'm suggesting that income inequality and inequality broadly is now carrying the debate, and debt is coming up second.
Yeah, but you know, I do spend a little time, and my wife said a little bit too much time sometimes explaining how the tax code came about.
All right.
And there are things that are called loopholes today that were once not considered loopholes at all. They're the biggest ones. They're the ones that some economists call the big loopholes. Like, for example, one of the very biggest ones, that if you have any kind of group health insurance, somebody else pays a medical bill for you, you do not report that as your personal income, even though you're receiving a benefit. But you know, that's not quite a loophole, because most of us think that
that's not really
this
a benefit.
Non-cash income, yeah,
Right.
that is, you didn't choose to get sick,
Exactly.
and it's non-cash income. So we don't. And similarly, we've always wanted to encourage people to save and invest, and we would like them to do that in this country as opposed to other countries too. So you have so many Americans now have retirement accounts, IRAs, or they have pension plans at their work, or they have 401ks, and they're taxed only when they get the income from that later on. Economists say that's a loophole. For most of American history, we just thought that made common sense. So I don't think, if you close what many people would consider venal loopholes, you're not going to be able to balance a budget. It's going to require some additional form of revenue than that. And in the past, politicians have raised revenue when they've said, I'm going to have to cut this, or I'm going to have to raise taxes.
Right.
That's the choice. And we have a lot of people who are unwilling to say that right now.
Well, you know, we have no evidence, Gary,
Yeah.
you probably will supply some, but we really don't have any evidence that, and your book lays it out, that the Bush tax cuts, which handed, you know, millions to millionaires over an entire a decade, even extending into Obama, they didn't put anything into. They didn't invest in anything. We didn't make anything out of that.
David, I think that's a misstatement.
We had no net gain of private sector jobs after all those people had all that money to do things with.
Well,
So
it depends on the dates you look at.
it did, but here again, I would just urge. I'm going to say something that may be a little bit against and also for the argument. On the against side, look, nobody likes to pay taxes. And when you talked about the Bush tax cuts in 2001, 2003, people might as well just say exactly what it is, which is the substitution of tax revenue, of debt for tax revenue. Because all debt is deferred taxation with interest. Now, let's just talk about on this one thing. I'm sure people spent money doing many good things in the economy, and it increased demand somewhat. As Lloyd Benson said, anybody can create the illusion of prosperity if you write a bad check. But here's a strange thing for political observers on both parties in the 1990s. So Clinton raised the top tax rate in 1993. And you had people like Phil Gramm saying this was going to cause an economic collapse, and people weren't going to work, and they weren't going to save, they weren't going to invest. From the time that Clinton took office till 2000, the income of the top 1%, 5% soared, despite significantly higher taxes.
We also had a budget deal between the Republicans and
there was, but I'm
Democrats.
just on this just goes to show this one, it soared. And Democrats didn't want to say, oh, during the Clinton presidency, the share of income going to the top 1% and 5% went up.
Right.
Because Democrats didn't run on that basis. The Republicans didn't want to say, hey, the incomes of the top 1 and 5% went up after we raised taxes on them, because that disproved their theory. Now, I do think when you get taxes to be about 40% or so of anything, then you start creating incentives for tax deferral, tax sheltering, outright non-compliance.
So I think where we end up, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is this: that the American people have been essentially sold a bill of goods by politicians from both parties over the last number of years, when they tell them, yeah, you can have everything you want, and we can have lower taxes, and we can have more spending, and when increase debt, and everything will be wonderful, and we don't have to worry about it. And the message of your book is that only goes for so long, and at some point you got to pay the piper. So what do we need to do? The top things we need to do if Bill White was President of the United States and controlled both houses of Congress with allies who would cooperate with you.
And I wouldn't even need to control both houses. But I think what a president needs to do is they need to take a stand, and it would require some, probably, in today's environment, if it was President Obama, it would require somebody like Speaker Boehner and some of the allies to say, look, we're going to go into this session, we're going to convert Medicare from a permanent appropriation to an appropriation we make every year. We're going to keep the current statutory formulas. But we are going to put Medicare on a pay-as-you-go basis. And that means you're either going to raise revenues to pay for Medicare exactly like it is now, or you're going to lower the Medicare benefits to fit within the existing Medicare revenues for premiums and payrolls, or you're going to do something in between. But we're not going to borrow any more money for it. And I think what you would see is you'd see a serious national debate about, I think people would be willing to pay some more to retain the existing
and
Medicare.
Maybe delay the age to get into it.
Yeah, and then we would have serious conversations about the extremely high cost patients and procedures, difficult conversations for us all to have. But the way we sweep those under the rug is we just pretend the problem doesn't exist.
So that would probably be true of a number of things that the federal government is spending money like a drunken sailor on, which is all over the place. Because the answer, what I see is, it's basically, growing up, and you know that you're a father,
Yeah.
you would tell your children, no, there are limits. I mean, you've been very successful,
Yeah.
but it doesn't mean you would say yes to every expenditure of funds that somebody wanted to do. You just couldn't do everything.
Yeah.
For example, there's probably not a Bill White jet in the family that you use. Maybe
Right.
it'd be nice to have, but you can't afford.
Exactly.
The problem with the federal government today is the politicians are like, they run the candy store and all the candy's free, and they never want to say no to anybody. And I think what it does, at least in my mind, is treat the American people like their children, that they actually can be involved in a discussion and make intelligent
Mayor,
decisions.
does Gary remember a huge section of his party trying to shut the government down? Maybe not paying for our debt, that raising the debt limit. I mean, there are people who are trying to do something. It just happens to be really very dangerous.
Well, you're going to be, and I'll just say, one of the most interesting things to watch is going to be the division within the Republican Party. You used to have this, people like Barry Goldwater and Robert Taft, who defined conservatism, who just thought that if you're going to have a new program, you got to have new taxes. Otherwise, otherwise you're going to promote the growth of government. That was the old school conservative. Now you have this division that I sense is out there between the more small government libertarian conservatives. Ron Paul, that y'all know, it was a little quirky, but there is this schism within the Republican Party of trying to corral some of those economic conservatives who want more limited government, and yet session after session you have Republicans advocating a higher and higher Pentagon budget. And it used to be in the old days that was, after World War II, there was that schism in the Republican Party.
Right.
But you can't have it both ways. You can't have it both a whole lot, a global security umbrella for the entire earth,
Not pay for
and
it.
then say we're not going to pay for it, because really what you're doing is disarming.
Well, in the same token, from the Democratic Party standpoint, they've got to decide if they want to be responsible. And I guess from
Right.
both standpoints, the big question, Linda, that I think we face is, do we have anyone running to run for national office that's ready to have an honest conversation with the American people?
I think
Besides Bill White.
No, Bill's future employer, Hillary Clinton, is
listen,
probably on board.
Y'all are going to start.
She's on board.
Well, Bill, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yes, it was a fascinating conversation. Linda, this is a great book to read. People need to take it to heart. The country is going to go down the tubes economically if we don't take Bill's advice.
All right. Thank you so much. Great conversation. And remember, you can catch Red, White, and Blue every Friday at 7:30 p.m. right here on Channel 8, and again Saturdays at 6:30 p.m. We also invite you to visit us online and send us your comments. We want to hear what you are saying about the issues that affect Houston. You can submit your comments at houstonpublicmedia.org or on Facebook. And while you're there, don't forget to like us. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you again next week. Good night.